right, Phil, I'm so excited to have a coach conversation. Just you and me. This is some of the brings me the greatest joys. I like to call this time philosophy. Get it? A little pun there. Maybe you can treat this a little bit as philanthropy, little there. Or my favorite, which is when you get spicy, is unfiltered.
Yeah.
But I got a couple topics
Older
I'd love
gentleman
to
with
run
a
by you.
microphone.
Say that again.
I said older gentleman with a microphone. That's always dangerous thing.
You have lots of warnings for us. You've seen a lot, and I'm so excited to just harvest some of that wisdom. There's a couple topics, I think that I'm seeing regularly, you face regularly that, we have side conversations on, but just to capture some of these for us to share with others, just to learn from each other. So first one is, and it's what we see time and time again, is barriers to growth. People have different reasons for barriers. Is it the people that I have? Is it some scale, size, impact that I hit? Is it my own leadership and my own capacity? We have so many different ideas of what could be a barrier to growth. What have you seen that we can maybe anticipate, plan for? And it's maybe even regardless of size, what transcends each of those barriers? What can we learn from some of the barriers you've broken in your leadership and in organizations you've helped run and scale?
Yeah, no, it's such a great topic and great question. And I think, probably every time we talk about these things, I always start off by saying, it's complex, but let's pick pick a thing or two to talk about. We had talked about this before, and I was kind of really thinking through it. And I think one of the key things that a bunch of the reasons and barriers to growth, kind of where they rest or what they're a part of, is capacity. And I would use the term making room. I think when you're actively doing what you're doing, you're really focused on what you're doing. And it's smart to do that and to not think too much about, this mysterious thing in the future called growth. But I do think you have to create a capacity for there to be growth in and to be prepared for it. And I think the Bible uses the term making room. Yeah. And we see it really throughout the Bible. And I was reading in Luke 22 about, been watching The Chosen, which is amazing. People haven't seen it. It just brings you into the scene, if you will, and you pick up these nuances and things. And it was the scene where in Luke 22, 12, they were talking about, that Mark gets this vision to prepare a room, and it's the room that he has no idea why he's preparing for it, but he knows it's important. And ultimately it becomes the room that, they have the Last Supper in. And there's some things out of that really have helped me understand kind of the things that I've seen in organizational leadership. And excuse me. And one of them is, it was that room was to be already furnished. It says in Luke 22, it says, and he will show you a large upper room already furnished, making preparations there. Key to that is making preparations. So, and I'm not trying to say it's always a physical space. I think in church, we think of we got to have a space for people to gather, but it's really about making room does my culture have capacity? If God brought me more people and he gave me more resources, does my culture have a capacity to absorb and wrap itself around that? Are we preparing our culture that me and my lead team or me and my leadership team are the only ones that could ingest new people into our culture? Or have we pushed our culture deep into the organization, where if somebody comes to see and hear that, they could be a part of this, are our systems built at capacity right now, or have we overbuilt them to allow for capacity for what is yet to come.
Yeah.
You know, that's a whole nother thing of, and, we work with people every day and have the great joy of doing that around, you know, what does the future look like? Take a guess and let's plan for that, not just in a dream state, but what systems would we need today? They're the same systems, but how would we scale them
Right.
and create capacity if God chose us, if we were fortunate enough that God chose us as leaders to manage that and be capable. And I think the last one is character. Are
Mhm.
you deepening your character, creating additional capacity for God to trust you with more
Yeah.
people and more resources? If God gave you more, would you have to scurry around and try to figure out how to be a better leader, how to be a better man, a better woman, you know, or have you already created that capacity for what might come in the future?
Yeah. I love that because we're not just thinking physical spaces, we're thinking emotionally, we're thinking mentally. Uh, because I think we get stuck in like we're reacting to what's happening week in and week out, trying to do the work to create more. But when more actually comes, are we even ready? I love that. Have we made room for if 100 new people came, or if 10 more leaders said yes to this, or if have we even built a space in the organization, within the culture, on the team? Do we have positions that are ready? And I know one of the principles that we share when it comes to the organizational scale is design for the future, adapt for the present. And that's one of the
Yeah,
big ones that we would say, hey, you might have to fill a couple of gaps. We call them
right.
plus ones, so that if knowing that my job over the next 6 months is to identify, place, train, and hand off that position, which means you've made room for somebody else to join it, versus that just always becomes my job. And I
Yeah.
think that's what gets frustrating. We see a lot of people, they hit a barrier and then they burn out because they never had a plan for what's beyond. That's really
Right.
good.
And I think sometimes, again, the space analogy can be space. It can be, are you making space for
Sure.
people?
Yeah.
What would that space be like if
Yeah.
people showed up? But whether it's in the true space form or an analogy of making space in your organization, if somebody showed up, I think in your church, one of the things that struck me, again, watching The Chosen and watching Mark physically prepare for something he wasn't totally sure about, but he said, he saw a room and it was furnished. So he went through and was painstakingly making sure that there were plates, that there were goblets, that there was silverware, that there was all the things that if somebody came in here, how would they functionally be not just honored, because he wanted it to smell great. And, there was little glimpses of that, if you will. And that plays out in the Bible, not in as much detail, but at the end of the day, he imagined what it would be. And then it actually showed him, again, it's their version of it, but he kind of sees them coming in. And when the disciples came in and Jesus came in, they were able to greet each other, sit
Yeah.
down. There wasn't like, hey, where are we supposed to sit? There isn't enough chairs. It was all set. There was
Yeah.
nothing they had to do in it, which is, I think, the key to everything is we're trying to set the table for relationship, not only relationship with God, but relationship with other believers and making people feel seen and heard and loved. And if people come into, if you will, the space, and that's the time you're figuring out and you're running to get chairs and you're trying to cover up the smell that you should have covered up before, then it's a distraction, and that's not the
Yeah.
first thing you want people to feel. So I think the future shows up and we're not ready for it because we've been so and it's hard to get ahead. I hear it when we were, we've talked about this before, and I always think about, like if I'm saying this in front of, pastors that are trying to either, build a church or build more or rebuild whatever it is, that it's like, that's great, the future's great and preparation's great, I'm just trying to survive the present. But I think that is always you always have to have an excitement, a focus, and a will to grind enough that you can be thinking about something greater, living in the present, but planning and designing and preparing for the future.
Yeah, practically when that boils down, I know like what you were talking about, even when the disciples are coming into the room, I think about like, man, are my assimilation systems in play? Is my database up to date? Is is our next steps process functioning well? Are we having it frequently enough to where we can point people to those things? Because I think it's like, yeah, we're still doing things the way we used to do when we were 300, but now we're 500. And in reality, it's saying, well, that's almost double, so like you gotta begin to adapt and to change things. Think about my Sunday through Thursday, or my Friday through what think about my 7-day work week. When do I how can I carve out that time, make that space, just even mentally, where could I get started so that I can make room for barriers not yet hit, or barriers that I'm facing right now?
Yeah. I mean, one of the times I love, and I think we think when we hear that question, a lot of people probably just heard like, man, this is going to be like a complex process. And I think one of the simple things that you can do that's actually, I think it's fuel and energy as well, is just take a section of your team meeting or your staff meeting, whatever level you're at in the organization. If you're the leader, it might be your lead team meeting or your directional team meeting. If you're in the middle of the organization, it might be your weekly meeting with your team. Is to give people a heads up and just say, we're going to spend, it could be 15 minutes, could be 30 minutes of our meeting next week. And we're going to be thinking about, you know, what are the potential barriers that we might face in the future to growing,
Yeah.
and, put it out there and let people, ruminate on it a little bit. And then they can come with ideas, but then you just guide them through a process of, let's think through the next, and it could be depending on where you're at. Like if you're a highly polished organization, you're 25 years in and you got it pretty dialed in, then maybe you challenge yourself to do the next 5 years.
Yeah.
If if your church is 2 years old, maybe it's the next 6 months.
Right.
But just like I can sit here and say, if you're like, well, what am I thinking about? Well, start with the weather. And I'm being serious, but half kidding, but serious. It's like, you can look and see what the weather's going to be. And if a storm is coming, do you have umbrellas? And it's whatever it would be in the future that you might think. For example, if it was 3 months ago, it might be thinking about, some of the political stuff that's going on that might put a temporary wrench in the economy. What would happen, if one barrier to growth, if giving drops back a
Yeah.
bit, that's a barrier to growth sometimes.
Yeah.
And like, what would we do if that happens? Well, let's talk through that. Well, do we have reserves? Should we start building reserves?
Yeah.
It opens up the conversation. And I think practically you can have a separate meeting, but if that feels heavy, like we're just so busy, we can't even meet about the important stuff, then just carve out.
Yeah.
And what I intimated to before, that it can be exciting, is just like, for me, I got a bunch of real problems to deal with that some of them I'm pulling my hair out about. And if you give me 30 minutes to kind of think about the future and kind of talk about stuff that really matters a lot, but it isn't like, I know I don't have to walk out of this room and deal with, it feels like it's a little bit of, it's what, now I'm spacing out. What's this, when you're eating sushi, the stuff you eat that cleanses your palate is,
Sushi.
not wasabi.
Not wasabi.
Whatever. It's a palate cleanser.
Right.
It's like a minute out of my day-to-day grind to, consider it fun to kind of go like, what would our strategy be? And it can start turning into some real things that we could bake into,
Yeah.
our weekly process. If we just discovered, wow, we got nothing going on to prepare us in that direction, then what's one thing that we might be able to talk about over the next couple months that we could implement in the few minutes each week that we have, and maybe start a dialogue where it becomes a fun time to start planning and dreaming about.
Yeah,
It's fun to dream about success. Like, if we were really successful, what would that look like and what would we need?
I like that, because what I'm learning and hearing is we're just going to take time to break out of the reaction,
Mm,
give ourselves a little bit of time without the pressure and stress to look ahead, and then really get our finger on the pulse of what could be, and then how do we start anticipating today for something like that. I bet that alone, especially if you earmark it, let's start somewhere just 6 months out, and then you can start moving. You'll always be 6 months out, or you can move further and further out.
yep.
You'll have a good idea of the trend over the next few seasons or the next season, and be able to anticipate that. That's
Yeah.
great.
Yep.